In photography, the use of perspective is extremely important for composing. Perspective is used to create a sense of depth in photos and to bring about significant changes. It is also used to elevate the main subject in order to make it more prominent. Firstly, it is important to note that the photograph captured by a camera is always taken from a specific viewpoint. Therefore, if the photo is held at a particular distance and angle relative to the camera's viewpoint in front of the viewer's eye, it signifies that the viewer, in this case the observer, is perceiving it from the appropriate perspective. The distance and the angle of photograph relative to the viewer should be set in a way that the scene depicted in the photograph appears geometrically identical to the original scene. When taking a photo from the same location, the use of telephoto lens and a wide-angle lens will result in different appearances. Compared to this situation, a lens with a longer focal length will capture only a small portion of the scene in the photograph, and smaller objects that are further away from the camera appear magnified. When photographs are taken from the same viewpoint, one with the telephoto lens and another with a wide-angle lens, the resulting images will exhibit different magnifications based on the focal length of the lens used. A telephoto lens will magnify objects in the scene more than a wide-angle lens. However, if the photo is taken with a wide-angle lens and is magnified to match the field of view of the telephoto lens, the images of objects will coincide exactly in both photos. That means the relative distances and relative sizes of all objects in the scene will appear exactly same. However, when photographs are taken from different viewpoints, that is locations, the relative sizes of all the objects and the relative distances between them are different. The change in perspective resulting from capturing the scene from different angles or positions leads to differences in the perceived sizes and distances of objects within the photograph. Different viewpoints can result in different angles, proportions, and spatial relationships within this frame, allowing for creative control over the composition and visual impact of the photograph. When a photo is taken from a wide-angle lens, objects close to the camera appear larger in relation to objects further away from the camera. You can emphasize the depth and distance between objects by positioning your camera closer to the foreground subjects, making them appear larger in comparison to the objects in the background. This technique can add a sense of depth in images. Let us first see what perspective means. Perspective means to see through. That is, imagine that you are looking at a natural scene through a window or a frame that measures 6.5 inches by 8.5 inches. This window or frame is positioned at the distance of 10 inches from your eyes. On the top of that, there is a transparent glass placed, and through that glass you are viewing the scene on the other side. While observing a scene, imagine that suddenly an image of that scene is formed on the glass of the window. If you were observing the same scene from the same viewpoint, that is the same location, from a distance of 10 inches, the image formed on the glass would appear to be indistinguishable from the scene itself that you are viewing. This can be interpreted as viewing the photo with precise perspective, meaning that you are seeing the photo accurately from the correct perspective. Perspective in art refers to the technique of representing three-dimensional objects and space on a two-dimensional surface. A picture that accurately portrays the length, width, and thickness of objects while creating an illusion of depth in an example of perspective in art. Creating the illusion of three dimensions in an image on a two-dimensional surface is one of the main objectives of perspective. To create the illusion of three dimensions in a photograph, various techniques are employed. We have already learned that by introducing strong foreground in a photo can enhance the perception of depth and create a sense of three dimensions. Positioning the foreground to occupy about 1/8 of the frame can help create a more immersive and layered composition. When two parallel lines extend into the distance, they appear to converge and meet at a single point on the horizon. This point is known as vanishing point. The use of vanishing points in an image can create a sense of depth and perspective. By incorporating parallel lines that converge towards the vanishing point, the picture gives an illusion of receding space and adds three dimensions. Objects that are closer to the viewer and have a known size contribute to the creation of a sense of three dimensions. Lenses of different focal lengths can be used to depict perspective, and each lens provides a unique perspective in the resulting image. A normal lens with an angle of view similar to that of human eye typically shows a natural and proper perspective on photographs. Wide-angle lenses, on the other hand, have a wider angle of view which can exaggerate perspective and create a sense of depth in the image. On the opposite end, telephoto lenses have a narrower angle of view which can compress perspective and make objects appear closer together, resulting in a flat image where the distance between objects may seem reduced. Similarly, maintaining a balance between shadows and highlights is an effective way to represent depth in a photograph. Shadows can add depth by providing contrast and creating a sense of volume, while highlights can help define the subject and contours of the object. There are various types of perspectives, and 3 or 4 of them are commonly used in photography on a large scale. Types of perspectives include linear perspective, aerial perspective means atmospheric perspective, diminishing perspective, flat perspective or compressed perspective, distorted perspective, oblique perspective, panoramic perspective, and many more. However, linear perspective, aerial perspective, diminishing perspective, and forced perspective are most commonly used in photography to create a sense of depth, elevate the perceived dimensionality of the photo, or capture intriguing shots. Linear perspective. If we stand on a long straight road, we notice that the road's edges and the poles on the side of the road appear to converge. As they extend into the distance, the gap between them progressively narrows. Eventually, at a significant distance, they appear to merge and converge with each other, creating an illusion of depth. The railway tracks, as they recede from the photographer, seem to converge, creating a perception of depth. The photograph gives the impression of directly observing the scene, and the depicted room appears spacious. This effect is achieved by utilizing linear perspective. If the train tracks in your photo are parallel to each other and not receding, they will not appear to be moving away from you. Even when observing a tall building, it gives the impression that the sides of the building walls converge as they ascend. In the photo, the base of the building appears wider, while the top appears narrower, creating a sense of linear perspective. Atmospheric perspective also known as aerial perspective, is a term used to describe the perception of distance or creation of depth in a landscape, or when capturing photos. It is achieved by elongating the perceived distance due to the influence of atmospheric condition, resulting in the depiction of three-dimensional space. When light travels from a distance and passes through particles of dust and tiny droplets of water in the atmosphere, it scatters and cannot reach us in its entirely. The environment appears hazy and distant scenes lose clarity, appearing less defined as a level of haze increases. At a short distance, the haze is not as pronounced and the details of the scene are more visible. When we observe a scene with our naked eyes, we estimate the distance and the same estimation is conveyed through our photos as well. In such atmospheric conditions, when a scene is captured in photograph and when the sun is positioned either in front of the camera or at a 90-degree angle, the rays of the sun get scattered. As a result, the intensity of light reaching the photographer from a distance is perceived differently. While colors of different subjects lose saturation, the scattering of light from the edges of the objects also contributes to the loss of sharpness. During such moments, capturing a photograph without using any filters creates an impression of depth. The edges of distant objects may appear blurred or out of focus, giving the impression of being fragmented. The colors of objects in the distance may also appear faded or distorted. But when light reaches us from objects that are closer to us, the shallower atmospheric conditions result in less scattering of light. As a result, nearby objects appear less hazy and retain their saturated colors as well as sharpness and detail. When we ascend a high mountain and look down or towards a distant region, it appears that the distant region is out of focus and its colors are impure, desaturated. As a result, the distant region appears hazy and smoky. On the other hand, the vegetation near the mountains retains its vibrant colors and exhibits better contrast and sharpness. And because we often perceive distant regions as being out of focus, the concept of depth is ingrained in our minds. That is why, in photographs of such scenes, a sense of depth is conveyed. This is referred to as atmospheric perspective. Another one is diminishing perspective. Our brain naturally perceives smaller objects as being further away and larger objects are being closer to us. This perception is also evident in photos captured. The technique used to create this sense of depth and three dimensions is called diminishing perspective. It's fascinating how our brain interprets visual cues to create a sense of distance and spatial relationship. This perspective technique is often used in photography and art to convey a sense of depth in a scene. When a road passes through a row of tall trees, the trees appear to decrease in height as they recede into the distance. This creates a sense of depth and distance in the scene, emphasizing the perspective. The diminishing size of the trees is a visual cue that indicates the relative distance between the viewer and the objects in the scene. The perspective created is called diminishing perspective. When I went to buy a two-wheeler, I passed by a shop where they were parked. The two-wheeler near me appeared larger, while the two-wheelers further away gradually became smaller in size. This is something we commonly experience, and it creates a sense of depth, giving the impression of three dimensions. This effect is a result of diminishing perspective, where objects appear smaller as they recede into the distance, enhancing the perception of depth in the scene. Let us see some more examples. Trains halted at stations, river ghats with diminishing size of temples, embankments of bridges over the rivers, paved footpaths, and distant boats gradually shrink in size. The perspective created is known as diminishing perspective. The pillars in the ancient temple are indeed a good example of diminishing perspective. Forced perspective. In reality, it is not possible to physically grasp the top of a temple in the hand. However, in the photo, since nearby objects appear larger and distant objects appear smaller, this creates an illusion that the top of the temple has been held in the hand. This perception is referred to as forced perspective. Forced perspective is a technique that manipulates the perception of depth and size to create optical illusions. Let us look at these two examples of forced perspective. One should also know what is correct perspective. Earlier, we learned the definition of perspective in terms of photography. When a photo is taken from a specific viewpoint, it has a particular perspective. The relative distance, meaning the perceived distance between objects in the scene, and the relative sizes, meaning the perceived sizes of objects, are captured in our photos, and it is important to observe the photo from a distance that allows for a consistent and accurate perception of relative distances and sizes. This specific distance can vary depending on the size of the photo. This will ensure that the relative distances and sizes depicted in the photo closely resemble what would be observed when viewing the actual scene. From a specific viewpoint, the camera lens captures the perspective of the scene. In this perspective, the camera records the relative distance, which refers to the proportional separation between objects and the relative sizes of all objects, meaning their comparative scale. It is important that when viewing a final print, these relative distances and sizes appear exactly the same to the viewer as they were seen through the camera. It means that the perspective is not just about taking a photograph, but it also depends on the distance and the angles from which it is viewed. If you take a photo from a specific location using a normal lens and then magnify it to the scale of 8.5 inches by 6.5 inches, when viewed by a person from a normal viewing distance, the photo is considered to be viewed with a correct perspective. If the normal viewing distance is 10 inches and the viewing angle of the eye is 50 degrees, the diagonal of the photo being viewed should be 10 inches. Only when the photograph can be viewed at a glance and observed from a correct perspective. A photo taken with a normal lens and enlarged to 10 feet by 15 feet will be viewed in correct perspective only if it is observed from a distance equal to the length of the diagonal of the photo, which is approximately 18 feet. The focal length of the lens used to capture the photo determines the size and the distance from which it needs to be viewed in order to maintain accurate perspective. This is of utmost importance in achieving precise perspective in the photo. If a photo is taken with a lens of 24 mm focal length and has a diagonal length of 20 inches, enlarging the photo to that size and viewing it from distance of 10 inches should result in it appearing in perfect perspective. But if we see it from a distance of 20 inches, it means that we saw it in a wrong perspective. If you take a photo of a tall building and while viewing it, you keep it elevated at the same height, then you are observing it from correct perspective. Renowned aerial photographer late Dr. S.V. Bhave who resided in Pune, captured an aerial photograph. To ensure that the photo was viewed with the correct perspective, an arrangement was made to view the photo from an elevated platform at his house. However, this rule does not apply to viewing photos taken with a telephoto lens, bird photos, and wildlife photos, as well as very close up photos such as flower photos or macro photos.